Are we ready? Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the the Scarborough Black History Month lecture or presentation for this evening. I was here yesterday for a musical presentation that was excellent. My name is James Williams, and I look around the Century Center, and it is not full. So what I want you to think is we are few, but we are mighty. I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker in a few minutes, maybe a couple of minutes, but before doing that, I do want to take a minute to bring your attention to a couple of things. Number one is this beautiful social justice tile exhibit that is a project of students at the Chapel Hill, I believe Chapel Hill High School. No. Scarborough High School, I'm sorry, thank you. And so if you haven't had a chance to look at it, please do so before you leave. I also want to take a moment to talk about something that is going to be taking place on February 14th. Now, what is February 14th? What day is that? Come on.
Valentine's Day.
Valentine's Day, did I hear somebody say? And that's true. But even more importantly, from my perspective, it is also Douglas Day. And I mention that particularly in this space because this past year, the town of Scarborough had its 10th consecutive communal reading of Frederick Douglass's speech. We call it July 4th speech. It was given July 5th. What to the slave is the 4th of July. And one of the things that I started mentioning a couple of years ago is that we need to give some thought to weaving Douglass into the fabric of this community on a day in addition to the 4th of July. And how can we do that? Well, that's been solved for us because on Douglas Day, February 14th, there is what is being described as a transcribathon. And basically, what the people around the country are going to be involved in an effort to transcribe a lot of the writings of Frederick Douglass that are available, but they're handwritten. And so I've got flyers of the transcribathon that will be taking place at the Chapel Hill Public Library from 2 to 5 o'clock, I believe, on February 14th. So I'll put those on the table once I introduce our speaker for the night, Professor Joseph Jordan. Now, he was mentioning that he wasn't seeing too well with his glasses. I'm going to see if mine are going to help me. Professor Jordan is a professor. He's a teaching associate professor in the African American, and Diaspora Studies Department at the University of North Carolina. Now, recently, within the past year or so, he also served as Vice Provost for Academic and Community Engagement at UNC. And prior to that, he served as 22 years, I believe, as the director of the Stone Center for Black Culture and History. And you know, there are other things that I can and will say about him, but given that background, when I was asked to recommend or suggest as someone who might be a speaker for this evening, given the theme, the Black History Month theme this year, something around African American and the arts, he was the first person that came to mind. When I first met Professor Jordan, it was after I came here in 1990, and at some point, I don't know when, at some point, you know, 5 or so years, or maybe 10 years after that, I did go to the Stone Center and became familiar with some of the amazing work that that he and others were doing there. The other thing that I want to mention, and of course I can talk about his scholarly works and writings and all those types of things, which he does. He's got the receipts, he's got the credentials. But the thing that I think about most when I think about Dr. Jordan is how he makes himself available to the community and to the people, not just in Chapel Hill, not just in Durham. He has an international presence. He's even taught other places than the United States. I've had the pleasure of working with him on 2 fairly recent projects that I'm involved in, one being the Orange County Community Remembrance Coalition. He's a member of that coalition and has been so since its formation in 2018. And even more recently, he's a member of the Booker Spicely Committee, which is a committee that is working in Durham and has been for a couple of years now to bring some semblance of retrospective justice to Booker Spicely and his family as a result of the loss of their family member in Durham in July of 1944. And he's been very instrumental in that effort and a number of others. So he's not one of these scholars that just sits in the ivory tower and writes papers and teaches students. It's much deeper than that for him. And so I could go on and on, but I'll leave it there. I know we're getting started a little late. I had some technical difficulties, but we are ready to rock and roll now. So, Professor Jordan, you got it.
Thank you. Is this good? Just want to make sure the clicker is working. Can you show me where did our helper go? Can you show me how the clicker is working? These aren't technical difficulties. This is
We've got you.
this is what we do. This is a challenge, and it's a challenge that we'll meet. Okay, go back.
Oh,
You did it. Okay. So you switch back to the first one then, and I'll tell you when to switch. Okay. Everyone, thank you for bearing with us, and once again, thank you to the staff here and all involved, including my good friend James, for inviting me to be a part of this very, very important program. Some of us here, I will not call any names, are old enough to remember when Black History Month was Black History Week. And there was a week of programming, celebration, and we, of course, reveled in that period. And I also remember the arguments about why it was that we were only given the shortest month of the year. And I said, you know, my critique had not become sharp enough to focus on that yet, but I'm just very happy that we had a moment, a time where we could come together and discuss some of these kinds of things. I'm also happy that you invited me because this is the kind of thing that's closest to my heart, as James said. I started out in community centers like this. In fact,
sorry, we just need to reach
okay. That better? All right. As I was saying, I started out in community centers like this, and my first job was at a center where I begged them to hire me, but I was only 14 years old, so I couldn't be hired, so they let me volunteer, so I would come in and sweep up at the end of the day, and then when I became old enough, they made me one of the youngest staff members, and I love that, and I still stay connected to that center. What I'm going to talk with you about today, or what I'm glad that it was sort of billed as a conversation, because that's particularly how I like to engage with folks. And I'm going to share some things that I've learned over the years, some of these things that I'm showing to you, and some of the people you see are people that I've had the great fortune to see at one point or another. And I want to say a little bit more about them than what we see in the books. Much of what I was going to present also had a component that was sound related, but unfortunately we can't do that. And I can't sing, so it's not, that part will not happen. But hopefully you'll have an opportunity to jot down where those particular places are, and you'll be able to check online, because most of them I just took from online. This discussion focuses a lot on what I basically believe, and that is that the artistic accomplishments, the kinds of artistic objectives that we have as a people, speaking of Black people, and actually in a lot of these cases you'll see that it's a general idea, has to do with what happens in the popular. What we mean by the popular, we mean with the people, where the people live, the joys, the sorrows, the pains, the struggles, that almost everything that we see comes out of that engagement with each other. That includes the notion of a Black aesthetic. In some ways, it's been kind of a contested concept, but the Black aesthetic comes out of the idea that there is a creative commonality among Black people that is based on common experience, common cultural foundations, and a common worldview. And that not only refers to the source of their creative expressions, but also to the form, structure, and content of the expression itself. Many of you who are familiar with Du Bois and our good friend Rick Powell at Duke University, who writes about that, really reinforces this notion that the common aspect is very important. What I want to do this evening also is that I want to look at another way of understanding that, and that is to take a focus on the cultural politics that influences our understanding, appreciation, and assessment of Black art. When there is the idea of a universality within society, oftentimes it leaves out other people. Black art has always confronted that idea and questioned this encounter with other cultures that undermines in a lot of ways their own claims to humanity. We know that verbal and other expressions and representations reinforce the truth and artistic constructs that we create. They are our systems of representation. That when we look at this, that first slide of Angela Davis, we can see that for different sets of people, it represents different kinds of things, but it was a very, very important moment when that was created. Oh, back there, okay, I couldn't tell if that was another one. The challenge for us, and it always has been that, is that at the very moment that we become aware of ourselves as cultural beings, we are both enabled. We can now do things, and in principle, do anything that we like to do. But it becomes more difficult to be certain that it is the right thing to do. And so in doing anything, we fall into conflict with others, outside and inside of our communities. Thus, the cultural politics of art is necessarily concerned with the political struggle to first find and then defend the meanings of our artistic production. Let me say a bit more about that when I say that culture is the crucible from which Black art emerges. I don't want to suggest that there's a narrow definition of culture as referring to artistic production. However, in the words of cultural critic Sonja H, we focus on a wider definition of both terms that refers to the complex process in which people search and create meaning about their everyday lives as they are subject to politicization and struggle. Yeah, that's one more. Well, you know what you've done. You've actually solved the riddle, but in the wrong place. You're very good.
And kiss my ass, kiss my black, unruly ass, before love, suffering, desire, or anything you can explain. She's saying, and very plainly, kiss my black ass. If you don't understand that, it's you that's doing the kissing. Charlie Parker. Charlie Parker, all the white boys screaming for Bird, and Bird singing up your ass. Feeble-minded old man. Up your ass! They sit there talking like a tortured genius of Charlie Parker. Shit. Bird would have played no music. Just walked up East 67th Street and killed the first 10 white people he saw. Not a note. And I'm the great would-be poet. Yeah, that's right. The great would-be poet. Yeah, that's right, poet. Some kind of bastard to beat you. All it takes is a simple knife thrust. And then beat you loud boy. One poet vanished. Shit. The whole people of Iraq struggling to keep up being sane. When the only thing that would cure the eruptions would be your murder. Simple as that. I mean, if I murdered you, then other white people would begin to understand me. You understand? No, I guess not. If Bessie Smith had killed us some white people, she wouldn't have needed all that music. She could have talked very straight and plain about the world. No grunts, no metaphors, no winners in the dark of the soul, just straight 2 and 2 and 4. Money, power, luxury, like that shit. Crazy niggas turning their backs on sanity when all it takes is that simple act, murder. Just murder would make us all sane. Yeah. Who needs it? I'd rather be a fool. Yes. Boy, that's a laugh. My people, they don't need me to claim them. They got arms and legs of their own. Personal insanities, mirrors. You need those words. In defense. Listen, one more thing. And you tell this to your father, who's probably the right man who used to know his work, so we can plant the egg. You tell him not to preach so much rationalism and cold logic to these niggas. Let them alone. Let them sing curses at you in code and see your filth and simple lack of style. Don't make the mistake through some irresponsible surge of Christian charity and talking too much about the advantages of Western rationalism or the great intellectual legacy of the white man. Or maybe they'll begin to listen, and maybe one day you'll find they actually do understand all that you keep talking about, all these fantasy people, all the blues people. And on that day, as sure as shit, when you really believe you can accept them into your fold as half-white trustees, late of the subject peoples, with no more blues except the very old ones, and watermelon in sight. The great missionary heart will have triumphed, and all these ex-crews will be stand-up Western men with eyes for good, clean, useful lives, sober, pious, and saved. And they will murder you and have a very rational explanation. It's like young. They'll cut your throats and drag you out to the edge of your cities where the flesh can fall away from your bones in sanitary isolation.
Okay, so that was supposed to be an interlude. However, it's a little bit powerful, so instead of waiting till that point, I'm going to tell you why we play that. Part of what I'm going to present to you today is some periodization of the development of the Black aesthetic and Black art, and the notion of the Black arts movement. This particular piece was seen as the opening. Now, I won't say any more now. I'll say something later on, because what you see and what you think is not what you think and what you see. And we'll explain how that works. Anyone in here who's been to school knows that teachers do that all the time, and that's the part of me that I can't get away. I'm in the community, but I still have to do a little bit of the teaching. So if you go to the next slide. So, part of what I kind of theorize, or what I feel, is that beginning at the beginning of the 20th century, African Americans, or Black art itself, has gone through these periods, and each of these periods has been marked by what I call manifestos. And this is one of the first manifestos of the 20th century, is Du Bois' idea about the criteria of Black art. He argues that all art is propaganda, and it always must be, despite the wailing of the purists. I stand in utter shamelessness and say that whatever art I have for writing has been used always for propaganda, for gaining the right of Black folk to love and enjoy. I do not care a damn for art that is not used for propaganda. But I do care when propaganda is confined to one side while the other is stripped and silent. So in essence, he is giving voice to some of the kinds of things that we talk about when we look at how the aesthetic develops, that whether, this is what I always say, and when I am in conversation with colleagues, is that the aesthetic content does not always narrate your intent the way that you intend. When you go to films today, and you come out of the film, and you go there with a friend or a partner, and they tell you what they saw, and you tell them what you saw, and I don't know what you call them after that, but they're still your friend, but you just tell them you don't know what you're talking about. This is what it's saying. This is what Du Bois is trying to tell us. That it transmits something. It's never neutral. it's never neutral. Let's go to the next slide. If you can play that, you will get the wisdom of night. Will you play that for me? And you get a sense of what I'm saying.
Listen, young people, listen to me. Don't try to follow on down and watching me because it's a good town. It's a good town. I got to be gone, ready to on now. Be my free body in this mountain, run all over that town. Everybody that put up people, they were trying to down, Lord, and on now. It's a good town.
So when I tell people one of the first and most cogent critiques of bourgeois culture comes from Lead Belly, that they don't believe me. But I say, if I said to you that someone like Du Bois entered into a critique or a class critique at that period in history, and I also tell you that most people didn't read Du Bois because he was, how many people you think heard Lead Belly? Yeah. So when Du Bois tells us that all art is propaganda, in some cases it can be expressly developed for that purpose. In other cases, it can be for something else. You can go to the next slide, if you will.
Listen, young.
Give Lead Belly a rest. Okay, so the graphic that should be here is missing. So I don't know if it moved off, but in any case, the people, the map that should be here is a map that looks at black massacres that occurred going all the way back to the early 19th century up until the 2000s. And it's actually part of what they call a decolonial atlas. However, what I'm also asking people to understand is that literature during this period, as well as graphic art, as well as visual art, as well as music, all entered that fray of what we call the anti-lynching fight at the time. And I put Uncle Tom's Children there because Uncle Tom's Children, which was written in 1938 by Richard Wright, at least for me, as a young boy, was one of my first introductions to what had happened at that period of time. And this is way back at elementary school when I would run home, lock myself in my room with my Encyclopedia Britannica, and I had a librarian one day who handed me Uncle Tom's Children. And in it, there's one story called Fire and Cloud, which is actually the last little novella piece. Uncle Tom's Children is written in 4 novellas. And the last one is about a preacher who's about to be lynched. And he talks about his feelings about that. The rest of the book is also about lynching. There's a story, Big Boy Leaves Home. If some of you read the book, understand Big Boy Leaves Home because they were also chasing him, and he was one of 3 who had escaped. 2 others were caught at a lynch. 1 was caught and tarred and feathered. And he goes home, and it's his grandmother and his aunt who tell him, you have to leave. So it was the power of those stories. Those stories, by the way, were written while Richard Wright was part of the Works Progress Administration program. And he wrote it, and of course it was published by them, and that was one of the things that I learned about the way that public funds can help create what I think is long-lasting and important literature. As a matter of fact, this particular book has been set aside as one of the national treasures of this country. You can go to the next one. Hopefully this will play. As you watch this, I'm going to ask you to do something with me. They're also letting me know that this belongs to them. It doesn't belong to me. And if you want to get it, you go through this. But I don't want you just to listen to the words. I want you to look at the expression on her face, if you will.
And now a tune with especially for me, Strange Fruit. Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. Black bodies swimming in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth, scent of magnolia, sweet and fresh. Then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is a fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rock, for the tree to dry. Here is a strange and bitter cry.
For me, this is an important performance because in my mind, she was not performing. This was intended to make a statement. In fact, if you read the story of how she performed this song would always be the last song in her set. And in many cases, after she sang the song, everything would go black and she would just walk off. It was one of the ways that she felt that she could give voice to people who could not say anything. And I don't know if you all know the story of the song. The song itself was written by Abel Mirapol, a gentleman, Russian Jewish extraction, very, very much on the leftist side, was supportive of the struggles of African Americans and other peoples in the world, was also a school teacher. But when he wrote this, he wrote it as a poem, and the name of it was Bitterfruit. It wasn't until later on, until it was set to music, and they changed the name to Strange Fruit. Interestingly enough, this song was written as a protest about the lynching of two young men. And one of the other interesting aspects of this is that there was a third young man who escaped. And I had the opportunity to meet and work with him on an exhibition in Atlanta, James Cameron. And he actually went back home, and until his death a few years ago, he operated a Black Holocaust museum there in Minnesota, where he was from, because he also, with the meager resources he had, he wanted to make sure that this was not forgotten. But Strange Fruit for me stands out. In 1990, Time magazine named Strange Fruit the Song of the Century for what it had done. So let's go to the next slide. I'll try to move a little faster. I wanted you also to know about our good friend George Schuyler. I talked about these moments in history. There was a period of time, and I guess there's never been a period of time, when you have individuals who would argue that African Americans really are not privy to a culture or to anything that is specific to them. And this is interesting because George Schuyler was a Black intellectual. He was a novelist. He was a noted writer. He was writing Afrofuturist materials before anyone was writing Afrofuturist materials. And back in 1926, he was asked by the Nation to write an article on Black art, and this is what he said. He said that in essence, African Americans or Black Americans were merely lamp-black Anglo-Saxon. Aside from his color, which ranges from very dark brown to pink, your American Negro is just plain American. Negroes and whites from the same localities in this country talk, think, and act just about the same. So, what happens after this? Well, it's important, I think, that Schuyler wrote this, because the response to this came from Langston Hughes. If you go to the next slide. Langston asked the Nation to allow him to write an editorial in response. And this is the response we get. The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain. He talks in this about that there is a mountain standing in the way of any true Negro art in America. This urge within the race towards whiteness, the desire to pour racial individuality into the mold of American standardization, and to be as little Negro and as much American as possible was problematic. He also lamented the fact that he had met a young poet who was ashamed or did not want to be produced or introduced to the public as a Black artist. And he just felt that was so problematic. I put these two here because this is the next intellectual moment and intellectual break, because the Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain also functions as a manifesto. Because if you look at the last lines of that particular essay, he talks about standing at that mountain and looking over. I'm not sure if Martin Luther King read his work before he wrote his piece, but in any way, they still have the same sensibility. But this is also the moment where we have, if you go to the next slide, so everything is missing on that slide. Can you see it? It's all gone? Oh my goodness, it's okay. Let me describe it to you. This will test my skills. This is actually a photo of, quote unquote, the new Negro, because this is the dawn of the new Negro Renaissance. That this particular essay by Langston Hughes juxtaposed with the new Negro, right, that was edited by Alain Locke. Many of you know Alain Locke, who was an African-American philosopher. He was the first African-American to get a Rhodes Scholarship. And he also was one of those who really was able to put his finger on the pulse of what was happening across. Now, when you hear me say New Negro Renaissance, it's because I'm one of those people that rejects the notion that the Harlem Renaissance only happened in Harlem. A lot of, or a good number of scholars will tell you that in Chicago, in Washington, D.C., in Detroit, and places in the South, at the same moment, there were other kinds of activities happening that were comparable to what was happening in New York. But New York, of course, because of what it is today and what it was then and continues to be, really kind of talked about Harlem being the capital of Black America and and it's how we got to that particular point. In any case, this manifesto, the birth of the new Negro, the challenge that came out of the birth of the new Negro, and that was, on one side you had sets of people who were looking to formalism in art. On the other side, you had sets of people who felt that the vernacular should not be forgotten and is still important. If you go to the next slide. Well, do me a favor and start that at about 3:15. And this was part of that challenge. These derivatives of the field hollers and shouts that in the beginning were simply sung by individuals who were in work gangs on roads, on railroads, and whatever. And these, of course, as many of you know, were recorded by Alan Lomax, going around the South, not only to African American communities, but to Appalachian communities and other places, because he also, too, understood that the vernacular is, in many ways, the root of all of these others. And if you listen to jazz, blues, and other sort of formal musics, you'll hear elements of this. Interestingly enough, this is on an album by Branford Marsalis. He actually samples this and uses it in this particular album. But what scholars will tell you today is that this particular chant, or these kinds of chants, migrated. That when you begin to get mechanization and they no longer needed huge work crews to work on the roads and the railroads, they migrated to the penal institutions because they then became labor. And as many of you all are seeing now, that the labor in the Parchment Farm, that sort of notorious Parchment Farm, Angola prison down in Louisiana, you still had individuals who were sent out to work and remember or pass down these shouts and hollers in order to make the day go faster. These are the kind of things that were debated in the Renaissance. Should we be promoting this in the same way that we promote the high art? That individuals who are going to Paris, going to London, going to Europe, going uptown in New York, can we continue to push this as being relevant? And that was kind of the split that happened. Okay, let's go to the next slide. I'm glossing over a lot because I got a lot more slides than I thought. There's a rule of thumb that they tell you, or they tell me, that you should have no more than 20 slides. But, you know, I like waffles, man. I mean, I'm an organic person, and if it's there, and if I can share it, then we'll share it. This one didn't come up either, did it? Okay, and this is an important one because this one is a poster, and it's a poster of the Southern States sit-in movement, Martin Luther King defense. program. And it features Harry Belafonte, Mahalia Jackson, Sidney Poitier, Shelley Winters, and Diane Carroll. And of course, many of us know that Shelley Winters, during this period, was very, very active in the civil rights movement. But this was a dramatic presentation that was staged by Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee, with the money being raised from it going to support the defense of Martin Luther King. As we know, one of the tactics at the time that was developed against King and other demonstrators was that they would arrest them constantly, over and over, for the smallest thing, hoping that they would exhaust their resources and would not be able to continue what they were doing. So you had these artists, and one of the reasons I wanted to show this to you is because I wanted you to understand that artists in that period understood and did feel that they had a responsibility to be engaged. Harry Belafonte was absolutely critical in all of this, because in many cases it was he who went around and cajoled and rounded up others who would not have normally been involved to do so. One of the things I remember Harry Belafonte saying is that when he would talk to people, he would begin to understand that they had been taught all their lives that, only bad people go to jail. That's not something that you should ever get caught doing. So being able to tell them that against injustice, going to jail was a necessity. And he, as you can see, even up until the end, was with Martin Luther King. And after the death of Martin Luther King, many of you know that he also worked very, very closely with South Africans in the anti-apartheid movement. He was a key individual in that struggle. Tell me the next slide is there. Okay, before you click the button, I wanted to put the words of this there because in my estimation, this is the latter analog to what we see with Strange Fruit. This is Aretha Franklin. Go right ahead.
Take a look in the mirror. Look at yourself. But don't you look too close. 'Cause you just might see the person
always have to pause because that song brings back a lot for me. And I also believe that she too put more into it than what was originally expected. And I think that's why it's so powerful. So now I'm going to go back and I'm going to do some explaining. As they say, I got some explaining to do. If you go to the next slide. So it didn't even come up this time, so at least we're spared that. Let me tell you about Dutchman. Leroy Jones, or Mary Baraka, as he came to be called, has too much of a life for us to go over here. But let me just tell you about the writing of this play. This play was performed in 1964 in Greenwich Village and became an instant hit. He wrote it in one night. And I had, again, opportunity to talk with him. We did a program at the Stone Center based on his work, and actually I taught two of his sons at Howard, so I feel we're kind of close. But in any case, that particular play came out of something that he had been thinking about, and when he got the idea, he jumped up and started writing and finished it. When you look at the play, in fact, the play takes place on a subway in New York, and the reason it's called Dutchman is because it's a play on the Flying Dutchman. And the idea is that this Flying Dutchman is this ghost ship, and it's a ghost ship that circles the sea, and if you ever get on it, you never get off. And that was kind of the allegory that you see with her and him on the subway. As a matter of fact, during this filming of it, you can see the different streets in New York, and the last stop after, by the way, she kills him in the end. I didn't know if you were planning to see it, but I don't want to give it. That's the spoiler. In the end, she kills him. However, that soliloquy comes that you see where he tells her and goes through all of this, this long speech about, he tells her at one time that people like her can never see the pure heart, the pure beating heart, and you think that you can see the black heart, but you can't. The point of it is this, is that, and I've had this argument with colleagues who are adamant that it is a cautionary tale about black men who get involved with white women. And it is not. He is an artist. He is a literary figure. And there's actually interviews where he says, well, some people may want to see it that way. In fact, at the time, he was married to a white woman whom he divorced right after this, and they argued that this was part of it. It's not. It's not. He will tell you it's a critique of capitalism. It's a critique of capitalism, and that how seductive that capitalism can be for young black men and young black people in general. That it entices you in, and he says, what better individual to use as that representation? He also says the same thing about the idea of the ship, that once you get in and once you're part of the system, you can't get off. And the only way that you get off is at the cost of your life. So if you will, you can go online and they actually have the whole play online. But I also tell you something else that he mentioned to me. And in 1964, he passed away not too long ago. I actually took him on a trip with me to Africa. But he says, well, I'm going to tell you something. He says, I don't know what people think about it, but that play has put food on my table for the last 15 years. Because it has been translated into 27 languages. It is one of the most performed plays in the world because of the significance and the meanings that he placed in the different characters. There are really only two speaking parts, her and him, and they really have to carry it. But like I said, it was a hit. After that, it traveled to a few places. The thing now is to do it with non-traditional casting, with a black woman playing Lula and a white guy playing Clay, which is the name of the other character. and they've done all different kinds of things to try to spice it up. But for me, this is the piece. Let's go to the next one, and then, as I keep promising you, I'm going to speed it up, and from now I will. That one is not showing up. Go to the next one that shows up. Okay. That slide that didn't show up focuses on what I call the biggest break of all, and that is the development of the Black Arts Movement. And the reason now that I show you Dutchman is widely considered to be the first salvo and the first artistic product of the Black Arts Movement. Black Arts Movement, which was very prominent in the 60s on into the 70s and influences people up even till today. But you will see that Dutchman carries much of what Larry Neal and others who were what we call the creators of the Black Arts Movement talked about. What Larry Neal said was the Black Arts Movement believes that your ethics and your aesthetics are one, that the contradictions between ethics and aesthetics in Western society is symptomatic of a dying culture. The whole idea was that the Black Arts Movement wanted to propose a separate symbolism, mythology, critique, and ecology. The Black Arts and Black Power concept both relate broadly to the African Americans' desire for self-determination and nationhood. Both concepts are nationalistic. One is concerned with the relationship between art and politics, the other with the art of politics. According to Neal, Black arts and the Black Power concept both relate broadly to the rejection of protest literature. It speaks directly to Black people. And let me say that this was one of the issues with the Black Arts Movement and for people like Baraka, is because he considered Richard Wright and many of the writers who wrote in the 60s and 50s as writers of protest, what he called protest literature. In other words, it does not demand or articulate the change that should be made. It simply supplicates, if you will. It articulates to the powers that be by appealing to what they see as their higher Christian morals and their higher Christian goods. And to him, that was protest literature. That it was, it was pointless. That you had already seen. In fact, they argued that what you saw in the South, in Lowndes County and places like that, was an indication that you could not appeal to the higher moral ideals of someone who did not have those higher moral ideals. Can you see if the next slide will come up then? That didn't either. Let's go to the next one. Okay, well, before we read this, I'll say, this is what Larry Neal said, and at this point, you can probably figure out my age because I knew Larry Neal as well. So I knew Larry Neal in Washington, D.C., but this was in the 80s and 90s. But in any case, Larry Neal had already argued that there was already a basis for a Black aesthetic, or the idea that there were African American cultural traditions out of which we could create. It encompasses most of the usable elements of third world culture. Its motive is the destruction of white ideas and white ways of looking at the world. If you look at decolonial thought today, you hear a lot of that. It was predicated on an ethic that questions whose view of the world is more meaningful. The Black Arts Movement believes that your ethics and your aesthetics are one. The contradictions between ethics and aesthetics in Western society is also much more symptomatic of a dying culture. So, in a way, he's laying out more of a challenge, not only to what he calls white culture, which is problematic in itself, but still, he's challenging individuals to create from their own understanding. Can you go to the next slide that shows, we'll jump up and down. Okay, so you had this skip a lot of stuff, didn't you? Okay. So this is what he said. This is, I always put this in here because for a lot of people, a good number of people, it was problematic. For those of you who are close to my age in the audience, I will put this to you. There is this idea, and there was a production that came out of the revolution of the 50s and whatever in the Soviet Union and China, and it was called socialist realism. And socialist realism was this sort of presentation of art where you had, people marching with the shovels and the spades, and they're happy and they're going to work, and the builders would have everything. And that kind of socialist realism is something that at points would creep into what you saw with Black art during the Black Arts Movement, that you were in many ways encouraged to produce art out of a particular aesthetic approach. And that aesthetic approach had to have these particular kinds of elements. And if it didn't, it was argued that you were not. So one of the people who responded to this, and it's very interesting because Jack Whitten was an abstract artist. So he's working with shapes and whatever. He's like, how are you going to tell me that I have to produce in a particular kind of way? It's very difficult. So this is what he responds. And I often, when my students ask about it, I often use this because it helps them to understand what Whitten says. He says that I can't define what is Black in my work. I think it is not necessary that I have to define it in as much as I should know that it's there. I'm Black and my sensibility derives from my being Black, but I'm also dealing with art on the highest universal level. And that's what I want to be known for. I want to maintain that search for what it means to be Black, whatever it is, but at the same time, I must deal with this within the issues that have grown out of the history of art. So this is somebody I think that put a great deal of thought into how do I continue to function, not just to be relevant, but also to be thoughtful, to be critical, to make sure that we are producing something that can come on. Go ahead.
So, if it's okay.
Please do.
I'm sort of, this reminds me of Percival Everett, the Erasure, an American fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And that character, it's like, I want to write something that I want to write. I don't want to have to write quote. And I know, it may have taken things to the extreme, but if you could speak some related to that, to that piece. I don't know whether you've seen the movie or read the book or whatever.
I can't necessarily explain, but all I can say is that conflict, as you saw with Schuyler and Langston Hughes, that conflict goes all the way back. And it's, in my estimation, it comes from what happens when one people come to another place and are subjugated and are not allowed to reach their, I wouldn't even use the term reach their potential, but to express themselves in the way that is meaningful for them. That you're going to always have that. Now, one of the things that I do at various points in time is that I tell people, okay, let's not look at Black people. Let's look at indigenous people, right? Let's look at what happened to indigenous people. It's no different. It's very different, but it's no different in terms of their being able to express what it is. So when you look at indigeneity today, I would say 95% of it is about recovering that which they were not even allowed to explore and express. For African Americans, it's the same thing. So if you have someone who's part of your community who then just says, well, hey, it's too much work being, it's too much work trying to be what people expect of me. And that continues to happen today. That happens across the board. We hear it all the time. I'm just a human being. I'm not a black artist. I'm not a white artist. I'm just American. I'm just an artist. That is something that in those days they would say, well, that's something that you do. You do have to figure that out yourself. However, being a black artist, as Whitten tells us, doesn't mean that you can't aspire to the universal. Why can't black art be a universal form? This was the challenge. This is what Elaine Locke was saying, that they established this universality, and once you're in that universality, it's hard for you to think of anything that can occur outside of it. Can you go to whatever comes next? Well, we're not going to play The Last Poets because that's even rougher. Those of us who are familiar with The Last Poets, you understand. And if you could get to the last minute, and only the last minute, right there.
Maybe look at that.
That there. Okay.
Time was hard to hold the soft wanting of our hearts. And when we, the mothers and daddies of some road, would turn downstairs and hear two antennas to tune in the choo-choo madness and syncopated love with us from Africa. And we loved the time, and we took the time to love, and with the right time we love, and we love time after time. Will we ever love again? Will we ever love again? Will we really ever love again? Or will we just sit and ride away with the brighter tomorrows in the scag field, rat clutter, piss-dish laws of our minds?
Black people, what y'all gonna do? Black people, what y'all gonna do? Will the real black people please stand up?
So, this is partially an answer to what you were asking, is that was the challenge. I mean, you had, I don't always like to use the term radical, because radical in one era can be fairly, tame in another era. But The Last Poets took no prisoners. The name The Last Poets itself sort of turns you on to their idea that, the idea that they had, this is something that Rick Powell talks about. He says that, these kind of artistic expressions are very assertive and aggressive. They don't come to you and say, I bear roses for your consideration and whatever. He says, you're in the piss-filled, rat-infested halls of your mind. It's a kind of image that challenges who you are where you stand. Now, this is why I say that art as propaganda, to me, is, in those days when we played this, we would play them at parties. In between the dance, you played this, and then so I don't know if it took, because, some of the things that were going on in this party, but it was odd to know that you would have political content at a place where we're supposed to be having fun in college. But they are very popular, and not only are they very popular, they are a major influence on the development of hip-hop. Major influence, and hip-hop folk identify this on a very regular basis. What do you have next? Let me tell you what would have been on this page. There's a picture of Nikki Giovanni. There's a picture of Sonja Sanchez. There's also a picture of Wanda Robinson, and also a clip from Nikki Giovanni's Great Pax Whitey. And the reason that I had them here is because this is when, in the same way as you see The Last Poets, that poets began putting out albums. That they understood that that's what the people, you could not go to somebody's house or put in Jet Magazine, buy this poetry book, because nobody, that was not the dominant way. The dominant way was listening on your record player, on your tape player, and I don't mean it was big old VHS tape. But that was the way. But I wanted you to see that they had not given that up. If you can go to whatever comes next, and I'll jump to that. What was on this page was, and I wanted to do this for Carrboro because Carrboro, as I know, is doing something similar. And this was a development of the Wall of Respect movement. The Wall of Respect movement begins in 1967 in Chicago and spreads all over the country. And this is because folks were saying in the school books and in the iconography of the United States, you didn't see these individuals who had gone through or had great accomplishments. So all across the country, they did these murals with images so children would be able to see who it is from their community had gone on and accomplished and created great things. This is the way you limit this presentation that you may show up with the PowerPoint. Okay, you can go to the next one. What do you have after that?
Most of these are, and hold on, let's see what this.
Okay, this is something that actually the photograph is missing, but this is a critique from Herbie Hancock. And Herbie Hancock is sort of critical of what I would say is one of the major sort of schism points of today. And that is the difference between fame, celebrity, and accomplishment. And he's inveighing against the way that music is not necessarily just marketed, but the way that it's created. And it's kind of his critique. Now, I'm going to end with these two very quickly if they show up. That one didn't. We're going to play like a minute of this and then a minute of the next one.
From the beginning?
If you go like a minute into it, because she does a little arpeggio. Okay, that's it.
Ain't no daddy's where I'm from, it's just mad mothers and eyes that still see. They came and passed color. Why am I disrespected by someone I should call brother? And why was being pretty and constantly hate each other? Bad air in my lungs, man, I can't breathe. My eyes burning from all the dirt and the debris. And it's third degree emotionless on the scene. It's like a disease, the way you're killing me. 16, and I shouldn't have to feel like this. I'm 16, every young boy out here wanna get from 16 to me. And my mama going through it. 16 on the block, 16 on the block, 16 at all, 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 16 on the block, 16 on the block, around here cool.
So again, I'm trying to think of the best way I don't think I have to explain to you. I don't have to tell you why. At least to me, this is powerful. This is a young girl who's using the means at her disposal to tell a story about her particular condition. It's consistent. It's existing next to other kinds of musics that are coming out today, but it's no less meaningful. And she was 16 at the time that she made that. It wasn't something that was a great or huge or wide hit, but if nothing else, it told that story. The next one, and please don't criticize me for playing all of this guy's and not hers, but if you'll play this one, and if you think about it in the same terms, and then we'll end up.
We had a homicide yesterday on Hawthorne Avenue, then another homicide broke out. Fortunately tonight, because there's not anything else major going on down here in this ward, they have cops that's able to cover. But we arrive at crime scenes where there's officers that are there alone. The level of danger in this city is at an all-time high. And if you guys can convey anything out there to the world, for those of us here in Newark, we're not just the #1 carjacking city in the world. We're the #1 murder, crime city in this country, and we need help.
I've been on this earth for about a dime and a nickel, and ever since my birth, I've been too hard to handle. These city streets have turned this baby face into stone, and now I just wanna get away. Oh, get away and belong. Don't let the sick get me, don't let the boats get me, don't let the dealers trick me, don't let the streets wear me, don't let the corners hold me, don't let my mother hold me, don't let the hood take me, don't let this hood take me, no.
I didn't know I had another one, but anyway, once again, if you, I'm always impressed when the poetic impulses in young people come out in these kind of ways. I don't think that we could have done something for them, these two, that would have impelled them to create this particular way. The fact that they have the emotional range to be able to do it is remarkable to me. So art as propaganda, art as presenting a political argument is very, very much present in a lot of this. So this is why I don't dismiss popular culture or popular music or pop music. Because at its worst, it's atrocious. At its worst, it is atrocious. At its best, it elevates. I'm going to sit down while this is playing, and then I'll come and we can do our conversation. Go back. Go up one more.
Go back.
No, go to the next one. Next one, that one.
Okay.
Play that one. That, for me. And once again, I would appreciate that at the end of this, you tell me whether this is a performance or whether this is something that is true.
Broken heart again, another lesson learned. Better know your friends, or else you will get burned. Gotta count on me, 'cause I can guarantee that I'll be fine. No more pain, no more pain, no more pain, no more pain, no drama, no more drama in my life, no more drama make me hurt again. But I play the fool, go through ups and downs. the story ends for me, but I know where the story begins. It's up to us to choose whether we win or lose, and I choose to win. No more pain, no more pain, no more pain, no more pain. Silence your playing game with my mind.
Okay, so I wanted to end on an uplift, but to me, this is it's kind of a distillation of a lot of what I've said, that this is anti-war, it's anti-abuse, it's anti-drug, it's anti-crime, it's all of those kinds of things. And I would also suggest that this may be as convincing an argument as anything we might sit someone in a room and say. James, I know you wanted to come up and but thank you all. Thank you.
This was wonderful. Yes. Excellent. So, I don't know, we got a few minutes, right? Take it. And I know you all may have questions or comments, and we will take a few minutes to have you, give you the opportunity to share those.
What did they think of the performance? That's just that.
Yeah. So any thoughts? What about what you just saw and heard? Who's that, Mary Jo? I mean, come on. I know that had to move you in some way.
Do you think that was a performance? This is the question I always ask when I see that. Is this somebody gave her something to sing and she just sang it?
No, you can't perform like that unless you have lived that. And that's a lived experience that only you can tell. Nobody else can tell.
I'm kind of sappy, so you all have to understand. When I look at something, that always brings tears to my eyes because at least in my opinion, she's conveyed that. She's conveyed some of that pain in the same way the young man before her did the same things. Young man's name is Hassan, but that particular video ends with him in front of a church, and as he walks away, you see the cross behind him. So the producer of the video even had a sense of what would be meaningful as well as the multiple, it's coming up now. Isn't that crazy? No, no, we're not
I
going
was just trying to
back.
get a place.
We ain't going back.
Well, in America, wow, we'd love to hear a little bit. No, I
On the way out.
On the way out.
What in America on the way out?
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Was there another comment, question?
In the back.
I don't see. So let me, if there is, if you could take them to mic, fine. I've got a question. So, like the price to be paid, when an artist actually does engage in a significant way and rubs the system, those in positions of power the wrong way. And I think about like Frida Payne, Bring the Boys Home. I mean, it was just a great song that was enjoyable, but they took her down. They took her down. And I think in some ways, Nina Simone, even though artistically she was very successful, I think she paid a price, for some of her work and her positions as an artist on certain issues. Could you speak a little bit about that?
I don't think it's any different for you as a lawyer, or for anyone. For artists, being able to be in front of people or to have people engage with you is important. But there's a number of artists who've always been influential for me, who've always said that if I start doing this for the money, if I start doing this for the fame, that it becomes a problem, because that's when you're captured. Now, I don't know how many people want to work for free, and that's part of the issue. And particularly if you're an artist, you're not necessarily always making that much anyway. But what I would say is that it is, in many cases, a sacrifice. It is, in many cases, a sacrifice. And for some of those people that we know about who were never recognized until they're older, and it's very, we've seen it time and time and time again, and we want to honor them because young people rediscover them and look back and want to bring them up. And they say, well, why are you here? Well, in my own time, I was never celebrated. Nina is a little different. Nina had several other kinds of things that occurred. Plus, she was loved in Europe. So as long as she was loved in Europe, she had something to do. But I do agree with you that it is a choice. It is a choice to be a certain kind of artist. One of the slides that we had at one of the organizations was Africova. I don't know if you remember Africova. Africova was the African Collective of Bad Relevant Artists. And that was Jeff Donaldson, Wadsworth Gerald, and that whole set of people. They put out a journal called Africova, and they are another one of those who produce some absolutely, in fact, if you go to Atlanta Airport, Wadsworth Gerald has a huge painting over the Intercity International Terminal. And Jeff Donaldson also has some iconic art that he did along the way. But Africova is one of those that, they said, if we can't depend on them, we'll build our own collective and work from that.
So I don't know whether you got any thoughts on this or not, but somebody who I think doesn't get hardly any attention unless you look at Cotton Comes to Harlem maybe, but Chester Himes, a fairly prolific writer. He started writing and he served like 6-7 years in prison. Gets out, and before you know it, in fact, maybe before he's out, he's got articles being printed in Esquire. Goes on. Why does he sort of disappear off the cliff?
Well, he doesn't disappear. He's like a lot of artists from that period. He goes to Europe. He goes to France.
Yeah.
And he's celebrated in France for the rest of his life. So he, Josephine Baker, a whole range of artists go to Europe and they are worshipped. I wouldn't come back either. I mean, you know, he goes and everywhere he goes, he sits down, people are buying him drinks. No, you don't have to pay for dinner. Where do you live? Oh, let me give you a ride. No, and he continues to write from there. So, you know, I think you know the answer to this in great part, but many artists had to leave and go, particularly to France, particularly jazz artists, and to maintain their careers and to be able to make a living. So it's sad, but that's what happens. Any other comments? Any other questions? Go ahead, Laura, please. Yeah.
You know, when I said that very much no more drama, I had flashbacks to George Floyd and the response across the nation to that. And I'm not sure if the response was effective or not to build all these DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts in government, private, and I'm just curious your opinion on that, because it seems now the pendulum is changing again, where that's become a bad effort in the eyes of many, and I'm just curious your perspective on that.
Well, this is, if I go to my political engagement communities, this is what we all used to always say, you know, no permanent victories, no permanent defeats. That was our watchword. That we understood that in many cases what we were achieving was incremental, that what we were trying to overcome was monumental and over 500 years old, that if you rest, we used to have this thing we call it the clubhouse, but it really was my friend Sylvia's living room. But we call it the clubhouse, and we used to have a sign in there, no triumphalism. No triumphalism. That you don't celebrate any victory as if it's the end of the struggle. That you understand and you have a very sober assessment of what is necessary and what needs to come next. Are you going to preserve whatever that victory is? Are you going to extend it? Do you have to defend it? You have to really do that kind of critical analysis. In terms of what's happening today, I don't understand myself why people didn't see it coming. That resentment was building up. There's a study that came out. It's going to be published, and it's by a sociologist at the University of Chicago, and he did a study, a comprehensive study of January 6th, and what he looked at, I mean, it was remarkable that in the past, those kinds of events happened when people didn't have jobs, when people were underemployed, when they were living in poverty. And he says 3/4 of them were business owners, upper echelon people, and whatever. So none of that, but what factored in was their belief in this notion of replacement. That as white people, they were going to be replaced by these other sets of people that were coming in. So if you were working for positive change, going to the future, would that have been what you would be working against? So that's what I'm saying, that we can never sit back and assume that an accomplishment, that a milestone, that something positive is going to stay or stick. James is a little younger than me, but for me, this is cyclical for me. I went through all of it. Government cheese, projects, moved out of the projects, affirmative action, all of those programs that were supposed to advance us. And I also went back into the retrenchment. All of those kinds of things are part of my history. So I would never say that I'm not surprised by anything these days. I'm just not taken aback by anything these days. So, yeah, I do agree with you that that cycle, that some people want to call it a cycle, some want to call it a pendulum. But, you know, the problem is that the pendulum never stops.
So, let's give another round of applause for Dr. J. Yes, yes. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks to my DJ.
It came together in pieces.
Yeah, but you know, I had some serious
What's that?
I really want to. It came back to you, right?
But you know, I can see your demeanor once the sound. You were so